So let's take a look at the army list that won the single biggest Warhammer 40k tournament of 10th edition. A Necron list reigns supreme, and perhaps shakes up the format a little bit for their new codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it would be interesting to take a look at the army list that won the biggest tournament in 40k around, and have a look at the units picked by Matt Lorah, the champion of the LVO, and led everyone's favourite race of undead robot skeletons to victory, with an immortal battle line and many teleport shenanigans. In the video, let's talk briefly about what's doing well for Necrons right now, and what was used in this list that saw off all comers, some of the advantages of each of the units, what was played, and the runner-up army list. First up, Necrons do seem to be doing rather well in Warhammer 40k since their codex came out. At big tournaments at least, they look like they're establishing themselves as one of the top armies in the game. Certain builds seem to have enough power to rival Aeldari and Chaos, the armies that seem to have been running the show on the tournament performance since 40k's last balanced data slate. Necrons do seem to be doing very well in the tournament stats. Win rates are around about 55 to 60%, and taking first at a lot of big tournaments, the LVO being the crowning jewel so far. Out of the Necron detachments, it's really the Hypercrypt Legion and the Canoptek Court that are being seen as the ones that are most competitive right now. The Hypercrypt Legion being the teleporting Necron dynasties, the Canoptek Court having big damage boosts for Canoptek units, though in the Codex Necrons FAQ they got a kind of surprise nerf to one of their best stratagems that allowed them to throw out some fairly hideous amounts of devastating wounds with Immortals. For Necron units that are hitting the tables really quite a lot, wraiths with Technomancers tend to be a staple just for their enormous durability and still enough threats to bully medium-sized units. They're particularly nice in Canoptek Court. Katana are generally very powerful, with people absolutely spamming them, and some armies running, say, 4 or more. They're massively tanky and have huge damage. Their only real limitation is speed. Immortals still seem to see plenty of play, even if their favourite stratagem in Canoptek Court got reined in. It looks like they're the favoured shooting battle line for the army, seeing as warriors got so nerfed. For characters, Imhotep, Illuminor Zeraz, and the Hexmark Destroyer see some play, alongside some Cryptex to lead the Immortals. There's plenty of good fire support choices like the Locust Destroyers, Heavy Destroyers, maybe the Doomstalkers in Canoptek Court, and it does seem that Monoliths do occasionally get played in Hypercrypt Legion, even if a lot of the initial excitement about that one was to do with the Catan jumping around the board with that detachment. And I guess slight spoiler alert there, given that it was a Monolith Hypercrypt Legion that went the distance at the LVO. Matt Lorah's list that won the Las Vegas Open was a Hypercrypt Legion Necron detachment. This one's basically Necrons but with Grey Knight movement tricks, a recipe for a lot of power with the sheer way that they can bounce around the table, and having units that threaten the enemy far more at range compared with the Grey Knights. The teleport tricks feel like kind of Nethrek Necrons, units warping off the board, going into hyperphase, and at 2000 point strike force games, 3 units that aren't in engagement range can choose to return to reserve at the end of the enemy fight phase, coming back onto the board either via strategic reserve on the board edges or deep strike if they have it. You can use it to have your units repeatedly get the jump on enemies with shooting alpha strikes, quite nice for longer range fire support. You could use it to get near guaranteed line of sight with heavy destroyers and things, and it's really quite nice for the Monolith as well, as basically 4 of the stratagems revolve around it, but it's also a big unit that's got deep strike, and you could use it to set up units from hyperphase, striding out of the Necron's giant space pyramid to light up some enemies. For stratagems, by far the most important one is Cosmic Precision. This one's 1 command point to deep strike or hyperphaser units anywhere outside of 3 inches of the enemy, but they can't charge after. Means it's pretty excellent for getting secondary objectives, maybe even sneaking primary objectives if people haven't deployed carefully, or just bouncing something like an enormous threat into the enemy backfield. A lot of armies might really struggle to deal with something like a Void Dragon or a Nightbringer just materialise behind the lines. Otherwise, there's 2 potentially really quite big powerful movement shenanigans with the Monolith that could allow you to save your own units and get the Alpha Strike, one for reanimating while in hyperphase if that matters, and a 4+ invulnerable save for the Monolith itself if it gets targeted by something with extra AP. Jumping into Mr. Lorah's actual winning list though, here's the core of the army, which is really quite based around 3 big units of Immortals, 3 squads of 10 of them, led by an efficient contingent of Necron characters. They're nice damage dealers at range out of hyperphase. The Chronomancers give them some nice movement shenanigans and can cover a lot of ground very quickly, as well as durability. Illuminor Zeraz makes them tougher and gives them a bit of AP while being a big threat in his own right, and Imhotep the Stormlord can farm some command points. They make some pretty good use of the detachment's enhancements as well, as we'll get onto. The Immortals, for 70 points for 5 of them, seem to be the go-to choice for range damage dealers and synergy units for the Necrons. They seem to be the best shooting squad to build around, and far more so than Warriors right now, though they have some competition with Canoptech Wraiths for things to move forward and take midfield objectives. In general, I feel like I've seen more people taking Tesla. I don't know if that's partly just due to the devastating wound stratagem that they now can't use anymore, but this list chose to use 2 units of Gauss for the extra AP. The Gauss striking with a couple of shots at 24-inch range with lethal hits and AP 1. The Tesla just gets mass hits with strength 5 AP 0 as it gets sustained hits too. They get to re-roll the wound rolls on objectives as well, so really quite nasty if you're managing to target something there, and either variant will certainly shred a whole load of enemy infantry. Backing up 2 squads are a pair of Chronomancers. These guys give them -1 to hit, so they'll be a little bit more durable, and then they have a really quite nice move shoot move ability, meaning that the Immortals could be striding forward a big 10 inches each turn, potentially popping in and out of cover, but perhaps most importantly in Hypercrypt Legion it means that you could deep strike the unit and then also move them 5 inches. That could be really quite threatening to snag objectives. One of them takes the Osteoclave Fulcrum, so that unit will be able to deep strike anywhere on the board when it hyperphases, and one of them has Dimensional Overseer to allow an extra unit to go back into hyperphase. Otherwise, there's a big damage dealing squad with the Plasmancer. He's 55 points and brings some quality shooting plus some mortal wounds, and he gives the Immortals a 5+ critical hit. I'm guessing he might go with the Tesla Immortals just for sheer rapid fire damage, and he takes the Arisen Tyrant enhancement to allow rerolls of 1 for the bearer's unit, or all hit rolls if they came in from reserves. You could potentially have a unit just get a spectacular amount of fire out of this. Finally, there's Illuminor Seraz with really quite a big chunky stat line at toughness 8 and 9 wounds with his 2+ save. He's really quite nasty for any Immortals that can be within his augmentation range, improving AP of their weapons by 1, which would be quite nice for both Gauss and Tesla, and reducing enemy AP when they target them, making them genuinely quite sturdy with their 3+ save and the -1 to hit that they'd have from the Chronomancers. It's kind of annoying to kill with his lone operative ability as well, and can hit fairly hard between his range and melee both having strength 9 and damage 3. Quite good against elite infantry there. Then to support the big Immortal battle line, there's a whole load of objective scorers. The Hypercrypt Legion's really quite nice to hoover up secondary objectives. It looks like tactical secondaries tended to be played. Just having these units being able to just ping on and off the board each turn means that you could have a lot of board control and having them get where they need to. There's 2 units of 3 Canoptech Scarabs, who can even take objectives now if they happen to be next to Cryptex, and there are a few of those, but otherwise just dirt cheap units to hold areas of the board and move quite quickly and screen things are nice. There's a unit of Deathmarks that can deep strike, again a cheap unit that can actually threaten a little bit of shooting. They could even potentially try and threaten a character if they wanted. And then there's 3 individual Locust Destroyers, the regular ones with their Gauss cannons. For the Scarabs, they're 40 points per 3. Not really much damage, though they can threaten a couple of lethal hits. They're just quite nice as they move quite fast, and are pretty much an ideal secondary doing unit. It is quite fun that they've got their ability to self-destruct if the enemy does catch up with them, could trade one of their lives for D3 mortal wounds against something meaningful. They also have the opportunity to worsen enemy objective control if that's going to be a factor as well. Between that and the Cryptech rule, it could make them kind of fun if they did throw themselves onto an objective in a pinch. The Deathmarks do seem like a unit pretty much made for the Hypercrypt Legion given their deep strike. They could be jumping around the board to do secondaries and then take some shots with the Synaptic Disintegrators that are quite a good threat to Space Marine characters. Another fairly cheap unit and one that's perhaps a little bit more sturdy than the others. And then finally the Locust Destroyers just for 30 points for individual models are quite nice placeholders and a very cheap unit that the Necrons can field. Their damage output isn't even bad either, given the 4 rerolls to hit against units on objectives. Finishing up the list though are 3 absolutely enormous threats. I feel like for just about any Necron list out there it's hard to pass up the Catan with their current stats, perhaps pushing for some of the most undercosted models in the game in my opinion, and the ones chosen for this outing were the Nightbringer and the Void Dragon. The big scary ones that deal the most raw amount of damage. The Hypercrypt Legion does maybe feel like the friendliest one for them, given that the teleporting shenanigans can counteract their main weakness, which is slow 6-inch movement. You can have them teleport right up to the enemy and maybe attempt a 9-inch charge, or drop them 3 inches from the enemy somewhere behind the lines and watch the problems that it causes. The Nightbringer is 255 points, and like the rest of the Catan, he's just spectacularly tanky. 12 wounds, a 5+ feel no pain and halving damage plus reanimation protocols to restore those enormously hard to take down wounds is just kind of mad. Pretty much nothing kills this thing particularly efficiently, though weirdly enough kind of low AP things with a bunch of lethal hits might actually do better than anti-tank fire. As the Necron God of Death, he's got a massive attack with damage d6 plus 3 for shooting with Gaze of Death, and then in combat the Codex boosted his Scythe of the Nightbringer to damage d6 plus 2 at strength 14 AP 4, and that's before he drains life out of any enemy units nearby on a 4+ for d3 mortal wounds in the fight phase. I feel like it's just kind of hard to go wrong with in any Necron list really. Otherwise, the Catan Shard of the Void Dragon is 270 points. He's kind of on similar sort of threat levels to the Nightbringer with very similar stats on a few different areas. His damage is generally going to be a little bit stronger than the Nightbringers against vehicles and maybe against hordes perhaps. They're maybe not quite as strong against just other hard targets that don't fit those bills. Loads of his attacks have anti-vehicle 2+, and he gets a fairly good horde clearing Voltaic Storm in the shooting phase with sustained hits too. He also has the fun ability to try and rip some wounds out of a nearby vehicle and heal him for d3. That's actually really quite a big swing given how tanky Catan are and it is to take out their wounds in the first place. Finally, to cap off the Hypercrypt list, there is actually a Monolith in this one armed with the more popular Death Rays versus the Fluxarchs. When the Hypercrypt came out, there definitely was a lot of chatter saying that you didn't really necessarily need a Monolith to play the detachment, and I still agree with that really. But it certainly seems that a fair few people have certainly been making the Monolith work for it. Now that a list with it in has won the Las Vegas Open, you can't really say that it isn't a good choice. The Monolith is very tanky. 22 wounds at toughness 13 with a 2+ save means there's just really quite a lot of anti-tank weapons that aren't very efficient at it. Last cannons will be wounding it on a 5+, which is big. And while maybe it isn't one of the most looked to damage dealers of the Necron Codex, it's definitely threatening. The Death Razor give it 4 shots at strength 12 and damage d6 plus 1 with sustained hits d3. The Particle Whip hits with a bunch of strength 8 and damage 2 with devastating wounds, and the Portal of Exile is actually good in close combat as well, hitting on a 2 with strength 8 and damage 3. As mentioned earlier, it is pretty amazing in Hypercrypt as it has Deep Strike for big redeploys, has the Eternity Gate that gives other units that don't have Deep Strike the ability to turn up right next to the Monolith as another way that they can get onto the board, and also 4 out of the 6 stratagems from the detachment basically need a Monolith to function. So while I still say the best one is the Cosmic Precision stratagem, there's lots of good options for this, and with Imitate the Stormlord around to farm command points, there might be a bit more chance for using the big plays that this can have, or falling back on the 4+ invulnerable if you get hit by something really high damage and high AP. It looked like in the final game of the tournament against Aeldari, the Monolith was used to hyperphase and combat with Cosmic Precision, turning up just outside of 3 inches in the Aeldari deployment zone to take a big chunk out of their army. Really quite a massive and gutsy make or break thing to do in the Kingmaker round of such a massive tournament when you've played so many games to get there. Overall, it really is quite a cool list. An Necron Immortal battle line with a bunch of Cryptex and building round the Illuminor himself, backed up by some good objective support, 2 scary Catan, and it's really cool to see the iconic Monolith actually doing massive work in a really competitive tournament. It kind of goes without saying though that it does take massive player skill to make this work well, particularly with the Hypercrypt Legion just having so many possibilities with what you could do with those movement shenanigans, with so many options and so many different opponents that you could be playing against. It'd be kind of hard to know with what to go for the right one, which units to use your Cosmic Precision on, when you can afford to either commit or play cagey. Looking on Best Coast pairings, and I was interested to see the path to victory that the army took. From what I can see, these are the armies played in order. First up, there was Thousand Sons with Magnus and 10 Scarab Occult, then Adeptus Custodes that was Alarus heavy. Then interestingly enough, it looks like there was the Hypercrypt Legion Necrons 2 times in a row, and interestingly enough, they were just very, very different lists. 5 Catan on the first one with 3 of the Transcendent Catan. It'd be pretty terrifying to have those teleport into your face turn 1. And the other one really leading into delivering massive shooting units, big Doomsday Arcs and Locust Heavy Destroyers drawing a bead on whatever they want to. Then for the rest of the tournament, pretty much every player was someone who I recognised the name of. Most of them, I think I've mentioned a tournament winning list of theirs on the channel at one point or another. There was Chaos Space Marines from Matt Lorah, perhaps some fairly standard Chosen, Accursed Cultists, and Forge Fiends there. Maybe some of the most interesting things were Chosen being 10 men and a Master of Possession. There's an Aeldari list by a Cody Gyru. Looks like that one was recorded as a 1990 tie as best I can tell. Not 100% sure what happened there, but the list certainly looks really cool. It was Inari with a very heavy slant towards Drukari, with a bunch of Cabalite warriors and raiders and venoms and some beast packs. Then there was Marshall Peterson's Canoptek Court Necrons, a list that was actually very similar to this one, but playing Canoptek Court and with 50 Immortals. Lots of Cryptex and Royal Wardens leading them, just I guess for some spectacular shooting output, with the big rerolls of the Canoptek Court. Kind of weird to see that formation with no Canoptek Wraiths, and I dread to think of what it might have been doing if you'd been able to use the devastating wound stratagem. Then in the semi-finals there was Sweet Lou's Leagues of Votan. That one went very heavy on the Thunderkin, with 3 big units of 6 of them, 2 with Grav and 1 with the Conversion Beamers. In the semi-finals it was Unending Swarm played by Samuel Pope. Really cool to see Tyranids get that far, and with a slightly more out there detachment as well. That one had like 140 Endless Multitudes, with 80 of them being Termagants with Spine Fists, backed up by a big battery of Exocrines, and in the final it was Aeldari run by Folger Piles. For that list, here's the runner-up to Las Vegas Open, and again just a ridiculously massive achievement, placing second in a 900 player event. So much competition from so many good people here. This one does look like a fairly cookie-cutter Aeldari list. I feel like this is probably going to be a bit of a who's who of what's going to get nerfed on the next balanced data slate. Aeldari already had their points increased and they are light on the bodies, but the ones that they do have can certainly do some mad things. There's an Autarch Wayleaper that can farm command points as he jumps around the board with lone operative things. He has the Phoenix Gem to resurrect on death, which is kind of big on a lone operative. Fugan's here with his absolutely enormous anti-tank melter. Kind of cool that he is seen as strong enough to just not bother with the rest of his fire dragons and just go solo. There's a Spirit Seer with Fate's Messenger leading the kind of standard unit of 10 Wraithguard with Wraith Cannons, a big tanky unit to just take and hold the midfield, plus put out some massive anti-tank fire and reactive shooting against anything that gets close. The Incarnate here with the big toughness and massive melee damage and jumping around the board when things die. There's a unit of Rangers that can forward deploy, 2 units of 5 Swooping Hawks and 2 units of 5 Warp Spiders that are excellent secondary objective doers. They move quickly, can jump around the board, and can certainly threaten light infantry with big firepower. And then finally, and perhaps not much of a surprise, are 3 Aeldari Night Spinners. Some scary enough ignores line of sight damage with their devastating wound weapons, but perhaps even more scary for certain armies in just how much they can limit your movement and keep things locked around. I guess that might not match up as well against Hypercrypt, perhaps, given that a lot of their movement comes from teleport tricks. As mentioned against this one, it looked like perhaps the biggest and coolest move of the game was teleporting a Monolith behind the lines to attack the army, and then managing to tank perhaps a surprising amount of fire on that Monolith as well. The game itself looked like it ended 80-56, and if you wanted to watch it, Wargames Live looked like they were covering it. I'll leave a link to that down in the video description. Kind of cool to see the action as it unfolded. Overall though, this definitely looks like an absolutely terrifying Aeldari list, and to get to this level I've no doubt that it was played to absolute perfection as well. Come the balanced data slate though, I would expect that probably the majority of this is going to get at least small points increases. Depend on how mean Games Workshop want to be to Aeldari after they've held the top spot for quite so long. In any case though, let me know what you think of the Necrons. As always, let me know any other insights or interesting plays that I might have missed. I feel like the Hypercrypt Legion's maybe one of the trickier ones to appraise a bit, just because there's so many different things that you could choose to do with it. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.